Racist chef humiliates black elderly dishwasher until he finds out she's the owner's mother. The renowned restaurant known for its culinary artistry was about to see an amazing upset when black woman Grace Serene, 68-year-old, adopted a role as a humble dishwasher started to change in strange directions as Chef Richard's rule of terror reached new heights. His verbal assault and nasty treatment of staff became more extreme by the day. Among this anarchy, Grace's silence turned into a catalyst for transformation that nobody saw underlying the secret agenda she carried. Modest appearance, and what surprising obstacle a cook who has never experienced prejudices faces? Ask before we delve into this story of gastronomic mystery that will boil over with suspense and simmer under. Unexpected turns abound in the comments below. Where in the world you are seeing or listening from today? And if you enjoy, remember to subscribe to the Michelin-starred restaurant Lafayette, which towers tall and proud. Its shining front in the heart of the city serves as a lighthouse for the rich and famous. Inside the dining room buzzed the quiet murmur of unique customers, the clink of fine china and the subdued pop of champagne corks behind the refined facade of. In this world of stainless steel and searing heat, the dining room was somewhat different from the kitchen. Chef Richard ruled supreme at 45. He was in the height of his career, and his name connected with culinary perfection combined with his piercing blue eyes and salt and pepper hair gave him an image of refined authority. His nimble hands served each dish with the accuracy of a surgeon, but under Richard's surface level culinary brilliance had a darker side. His fury was as intense as the flames that jumped from his ego, as swollen as a stool from his professional-grade stoves. Fresh off the oven on this specific occasion, the kitchen was in its regular controlled chaos state, and cooks moved with deliberate lack, screaming out instructions and answering sharply yes chef at Richard's every command. The air was dense with the aromas of sizzling meat scent and the underlying tension that appeared to pulse through the kitchen like a living thing. Richard stood at the pass, laser-focusedly inspecting every dish. "This is insufficient," he suddenly said, freezing everything, and held up a dish of perfectly seared food. To the untrained view, scallops set in a delicate spiral seemed flawless. But to Richard, it was an abomination. "Look at this," he spat. "Plating is messy, the sear is uneven," pushing the plate toward the young line cook who made it as messy. He tipped the plate, sending the beautiful scallops, what you would define as Michelin star quality, without notice. Alex, a young male man, dropped to the floor and froze, his face under a mask of horror and, "I'm sorry, chef," I stammered. "I'll do it again right." Fear away, but Richard advanced on Alex, his face crimson with rage unfinished. "This is the situation in my kitchen." Backing him into a corner and apologizing is insufficient. "Third time this week. You might not be suited for this. Perhaps you should visit McDonald's to make flip burgers." Rather, the remainder of the kitchen kept their heads down, seeming as though they were lost in their work. They would have seen this. Before Richard's wrath, his merciless words, his ability to turn even the most confident cook to a quivering. It was simply another day in the pressure cooker the Grand Cuisine was running under. Kitchen as Richard's tirade. Laura, one of the waitresses, gently approached the pass. She was in her late 20s. She had soft brown eyes and a gentle manner that seemed contradictory with the chef mentioned gently in a demanding kitchen setting, trying to defuse the problem. "The Carmichaels are curious about their order." Richard whirled on her, his eyes sparkling. "Do I look like I care what the Carmichaels want right now? Can you not see I am dealing with incapacity here?" He motioned furiously at Alex, who seemed to want the floor to open. Laura flinched but kept her footing. "I know, chef. Up and swallow him whole. But they're among our most cherished clients. Maybe you should do your work and cease meddling with my." Richard captured. "Laura, withdrew her scorching cheeks from my kitchen right now." Richard turned back to Alex, ashamed. "For you?" muttered. "Get out of my sight. You're done tonight. Don't bother visiting tomorrow or ever again." Alex's face crumpled, but he didn't contend. He just took off his apron, put it on the counter, and left his. The ERS sagged in defeat. The rest of the team exchanged short, frightened looks. They all knew it Might have been any one of them in Alex's place. Richard looked over his kitchen. He heaved. Well, you all were staring at. We have orders to. When I returned to work, the kitchen erupted in feverish activity once more. Everyone was desperately trying to steer clear of being Richard's next target, since the air was clearly charged with a tangible undercurrent of wrath and anxiety. Working under Chef Richard, a guy whose talent matched only his own, was reality. Tyranny, as the evening carried on, more casualties succumbed to Richard's fury. When Richard announced the incorrect wine combination, a pastry maker almost broke down in tears. Sommier was chastised. Her chocolate sullies, an insult to cocoa beans everywhere, including in the dishwashers, weren't safe, with Richard charging into their territory to critique the water's temperature and gloss on the shine of the plates by the last visitor's departure, and the kitchen started its nighttime crew cleanup. Tired not, both physically and emotionally, they moved like automatons, silently engrossed in their polishing and scouring. Laura stayed in the dining room, guiding the other waitstaff member with her own ideas. Clear the last of the tables. She couldn't help but picture Alex's depressed countenance as he walked out of the kitchen.
How?
Before someone stopped someone, many more gifted, passionate people might Richard crush. As she cleaned a table, she overheard two of the frequent patrons talking about just leaving. The meal was exquisite as usual, but did you see the other nodded in agreement. The atmosphere seemed strained, too, and noticed how tense the employees seemed. I wonder if everything in the kitchen is in order. Fighting the impulse to speak up, Laura bit her lip, knowing that, should word get back to Richard, she had been gossiping regarding the kitchen dynamics. Her employment would be on the line, but she hoped that maybe, just maybe, if enough people observed, something would alter once the last of the clients left. Richard came out of the kitchen, his chef's whites immaculate, not a hair out of place, and now he looked at him. Difficult to match this polished professionalism with the raging tyrant from past first-rate performance tonight. His voice was clear and under control. We kept our standards as always. Remember, perfection is not an accident. Rather, every single day the workforce nodded at a decision we made diligently, but Laura couldn't help but notice how lackluster their gaze were. Richard might believe he was inspiring brilliance, but all he was actually fostering was fear and contempt. As they left, two of the line cooks whispered to Laura, "I'm not able to take much more of this," one of them said, considering quitting. "But where would you go?" The other, "Richard, name on your." Zara groaned as she gathered her resume. "It unlocks doors. We're stuck here if we want to enter this sector." She had heard many times before Richard's reputation as a gastronomic master implied. In the restaurant business, working at the Grand Cuisine was considered as a fantastic chance. Yet, at what? As she emerged into the cool night air, Laura felt something had to give. The question was, what would be the impetus for transformation, and how much more harm Richard could cause prior to it? She had no idea the winds of change were already whirling and would shortly sweep over the Grand Cuisine. Like a cleaning storm the next morning, when the first ray of sunlight started to peek through the modest city skyscrapers, led her to the Grand Cuisine. Helen Davis, a woman in her late 60s with silky hair and gentle eyes that wrinkled at the corners, stopped momentarily to absorb the restaurant's. Any passer-by Grace could have found intimidating facade to be simply another early morning worker on her way to a job. Her attire were basic but immaculate: dark, comfortable shoes, pants, and a neat white shirt, but she distinguished herself with a serene dignity and strength. Grace inhaled deeply as she pulled open the large door and entered the immaculate restaurant. This was her undercover mission. Started with her son Robert, the CEO of Law. Perfection had urged her to assume this responsibility after learning troubling stories about the poisonous surroundings in the kitchen. Grace had accepted without second thought, as her family considered this restaurant to be more than simply a place of business. She was resolved to guard a legacy like this. As Grace arrived in surprise, the maitre d', a young guy called Thomas, gazed upward. Although he answered nicely, "Ma'am, we are not open yet. Maybe you would want to book for." Later, Grace smiled kindly. "Honestly, I'm here regarding the dishwasher job. I believe I'm expecting." Thomas's eyebrows flew up in surprise. Oh, of course. Let me just. I got Chef Richard for you. Thomas vanished into the back. Grace stopped to look around the dining room, every table laid with accuracy. It was difficult to picture behind the scenes in the kitchen, the silverware shining in the beautiful morning light. A few minutes later, the kitchen doors opened and Chef Richard strode amid a storm building. He looked Grace up and down, his presence quickly filling the space. Face a blend of surprise as hardly hidden contempt drives you here. Asking for the dishwasher post, his tone made it abundantly evident that he thought the notion. Laughable Grace caught his gaze steadfastly. That's right. I may be older, but I assure him, you are more than competent of managing the slightly curving job that Richard Clip completed. We'll see about that, Grace took in as they passed the swinging doors into the kitchen. We will follow her. Every element of the modern equipment the GLEING stainless steel surfaces reflect. The obvious tension in the air created images of a high-pressure system in which perfection was the only allowed standard. Richard guided her to the dishwashing station, waving dismissively, "This is where you will be working. I expect every dish, pot, utensil to be perfect. We have a reputation to uphold here, beginning with the fundamentals. Do you believe you can manage that?" Grace nodded. "Serene, I'm sure I can, Chef. I've always thought that every work, no matter how little it seems, is absolutely vital for the general success of it." Richard looked at her intently, as if trying to decide whether she was mocking him, but Grace's face stayed honest and eager, as Richard remarked following a pause. "Well, Thomas will show you where to change and get you set up with a uniform. Not expecting much more right now. Any particular treatment according to your age in my kitchen. Everyone pulls their weight or is out." "Understood correctly, Chef." Grace answered, her voice consistent. "Thank you for the chance." As Richard left, already yelling directions at some of the early arriving crew, Grace permitted. She was a little knowing smile, and she felt as though her presence would cause things to change in ways that Chef Richard not could reasonably expect over the next 3 hours as the kitchen came alive around her. Grace got into her position. She worked quickly, repeated her motions, convinced despite her age she would always appreciated the meditative aspect of domestic chores and tackled dishwashing using the same deliberate technique. She paid close attention to everything in her life, while Grace watched the kitchen dynamics when Richard moved from station to station, his analytical eye overlooking nothing. His talent was unquestionable. The way he tasted a sauce and realized right once what it needed and how he could view a dish to find any flaws, but his communication style left much to be desired. "You are trying to poison our clients." Richard's voice boomed out, and Grace looked up from her work. He was carrying a pan of what appeared to be precisely seared fish, glaring at a young cook clearly shaking. "No, Chef," the cook stammered. "I assumed you thought." Richard stopped me. "I don't pay you to think I pay you to follow my directions to the letter. Start again if you can't get it right this time. This is overdone. You just as well pack your knives and leave." Grace watched as the young cook shook his hands violently. Then he grabbed for a fresh piece of fish, and she became sympathetic, remembering her own early years in the culinary world. Kitchens had always been high-press settings, but this degree of intimidation and anxiety seemed counterproductive. As Grace discovered, she was slipping into a pattern, the continuous flow of dishes kept her hectic schedule notwithstanding. She kept an eye on the kitchen dynamics and observed how the personnel seemed to flinch when Richard went out of earshot, and noticed how softly they spoke. It was obvious that while they appreciated his ability, but during a rare lull in the Grace was drying some exquisite wine glasses in the afternoon when she felt someone peering up behind her. Laura, the waitress she had observed before, hesitated to grab for a stack of plates. "You're doing wonderful," Laura replied gently. "I'm Laura, by the way. Welcome." "Thank you, Laura." The Grand Cuisine. Grace returned the smile. She is definitely Grace. An odd place to work. Laura looked about uneasily, then leaned in closer to listen. "I hope. Although this sounds patronizing, are you sure you're ready for this? Chef Richard can be really tough, especially on new crew, and the speed here is fierce." Grace softly caressed Laura's hand. "Though you worry about me, sweetheart, I have weathered my fair share of storms in life. This is simply another one. Laura gazed at her inquisitively, realizing this modest dishwasher had more than first seemed possible, yet before she could say anything more. "If you two are done with your small coffee clutch," Richard's voice boomed over the kitchen, "maybe you might get back to work. Tonight we have a full house in case you forgot." Laura jumped fast, grabbing. Grace only nodded at Richard and went back to the plates she need, running back to the dining room. Task her motions as calm and consistent as always while she worked. Grace couldn't help but consider the juxtaposition between the poisonous environment in which the exquisite cuisine was created and its preparation. Made her wonder what her son Robert would think if he could witness this himself. His father's goal had been a restaurant, and when he became CEO, he had promised to respect that legacy, but Grace understood that true legacy went beyond just cuisine or honors. Regarding the people, the society upholds principles. She sighed softly as she arranged another stack of shining plates on the shelf, clearly showing a lot of tasks to be completed here, and not only in the domain of dishwashing. Grace was nothing if not patient. She knew that occasionally the most significant transformations began in the most unlikely places. Spots. When the dinner service drew near and the kitchen's intensity turned frenzied, Grace stole herself. She felt tonight would be a real test, not only of her capacity to meet the responsibilities of the position, but also of her will to see this mission through whatever obstacles ahead. She was ready to meet them squarely armed, using only a sponge, a loving heart, and the will to make things. Grace arrived every morning right as the days stretched into weeks and relaxed into her position at the Grand Cuisine. Before dawn, her silence permeates the always shifting whirlwind of the kitchen, but as she grew regular in the restaurant, she also started to frequent Target for Chef. Richard's eyes began little at first, a sarcastic remark here, a roll of the eyes here. Grandma, Richard would snap as he passed the dishwashing station. "This isn't retirement home." Grace carried it all with a gentle smile, her hands never faltering as they moved from sink to drying rack and back once more, but she observed how the other staff members would glance sympathetically at Richard's comments when they believed she wasn't particularly attractive. One especially hectic evening as the kitchen was running non-stop getting ready for a big event, Richard's fury boiled. Grace was meticulously arranging a tray of just polished wine glasses when Richard's words sliced through the anarchy like a knife. "What the devil is this?" he yelled, going over to the dishwashing station, clutching a plate with a. Grace carefully gazed at the plate, barely noticeable speck near the rim. "I apologize, Chef. I must have missed that one. I'll rewash it straight away." But Richard showed no interest in her apologize. His face shows fury. He shoved the dish in Grace's face. "This is unacceptable. Do you have any idea what's at risk here? You're sending out dirty plates like these while culinary critics arrive tonight." The kitchen went silent, all eyes, some greasy spoon diner. Grace kept her ground during the confrontation they were witnessing. Her calm demeanor belied the chef's proximity and volume. "You're right," she said gently. "Maybe all you have to say is that it won't happen again." Richard sneers. "It won't happen again. After all, you are too old for your profession. Perhaps your eyes match your capacity for basic tasks." A collective intake of breath around the kitchen. Richard had always been strict, but this degree of even Grace, a personal attack, was startling. "Still, he stayed," she said, her voice calm, "and I reassure you, unruffled. My eyes are just great." Chef said, "If you will excuse me, I am more than qualified to handle my current work. I have dishes too." She moved back to her sink, so dismissing Richard for a. He stood there fuming with fury. Then with a last sneer, he rushed off, giving commands at the rest of the staff. As he left earshot, Zar went right away to see Grace's eyes gaping with worry. She muttered, "I've never seen him leave." Similar to that before, Grace smiled reassuringly. "I'm good, sweetheart. It takes more than a few nasty remarks to knock me down." Laura shook her head in wonder. I would most likely burst into if he spoke to me like that. I'm not sure how you handle things." Tears while Grace stated, her eyes glistening. "I have a lot of practice dealing with having challenging individuals in my life. Might amaze you what a small amount of patience and perspective can do." Richard's treatment of Grace progressively got worse as the weeks passed, thus seemed to adopt her composed attitude as a personal insult, aiming at her work and rendering sarcastic comments. Remarks on her age one day as Grace was having lunch in the tiny staff area. She overheard two line cooks talking about how Chef Richard handles that elderly poor woman. One of they murmured it like he's trying to get her to stop. I know, the other answered, but have. Grace grinned to herself as she ate. She never loses her calm, like water off a duck's back. Little did they know, every insult, every nasty jab was meticulously stored in her memory, and she was piecemeal developing a case study, and Richard was unintentionally offering all the evidence she required. While the humiliation persisted, Grace discovered surprising allies in the kitchen. Laura, in particular, seems to have taken it upon herself to serve as a barrier, separating Grace from Richard's worst outbursts. She would frequently find justification for near the dishwashing station during very trying times. Her presence also silently encouraged other staff members to perform little acts of kindness. A young kid cook occasionally would assist Grace in carrying large stacks of plates. The pastry chef would slip her an additional dessert at the end of a protracted shift. Grace seemed to have awoken something in the others by her quiet dignity in the face of Richard's mistreatment of the personnel, a feeling of unity against the poisonous culture that had evolved in the kitchen. Yet Richard stayed blind to this minute change. If anything, his sustained calm seemed to irritate him even more. He started to single her out front of the whole team, using her look at this, for instance, to see what not to do. He might say, hiring someone who should be in a pot. Grace had just scrubbed results in this. Holding it up. Retirement homes show these water spots. This is unacceptable. Should I make myself? The crew would nod softly, their eyes downcast. Grace could see the growing hostility on their expressions. She realized Richard's actions were not only harming her, but also contaminating the. One evening when Grace was concluding her shift, Laura walked across the whole earth, her tense fist ringing. Grace remarked in a low voice, I think you. Knowing some of us have been discussing, we might consider visiting the management, perhaps even the owner. Cannot proceed as Chef Richard treats all of us. It is not. I value your concern. Correct. Grace gently rested a consoling hand on Laura's arm. Dear, but kindly avoid acting rash. These things have a way of working themselves out. As Laura left still perplexed, Grace let her allow a little happy smile. The parts were coming together very soon. It would be. As the weeks passed, time for the next round of her strategies. Chef Richard's behavior seemed to get exponentially worse, his ego, already swollen to deadly dimensions, puffed even more with every positive review and esteemed accolade the Grand Cuisine received at the height of its popularity, convinced Richard that he alone helped it to succeed. The kitchen used to be a site of culinary passion, and inventiveness had turned into a pressure cooker of anxiety and resentment. Staff turnover was at an all-time high, with fresh faces virtually barely emerging, simply to vanish almost as becoming incapable of resisting Richard's relentless criticism and verbal assault. One nervous evening, as the kitchen got ready for a well-publicized charitable event, Richard's behavior reached. He walked the kitchen like a caged tiger, his gaze keen and analytical. New lows. Searching for any means to let off his wrath. You called Julie. He bellowed at a young prep cook, taking the knife from her hands. These seemed to have been cut by a blind monkey. Watch and learn. He then started to show the correct method, his motions quick and exact, but his remarks rising as he worked, proceeded to criticize the young cook. Progressively intimate and harsh. How did you even land recruited here? He sneered. You either slept your way into this kitchen or lie on your CV. The cook's eyes glowed with weeping, but she dared not move or say. The rest of the staff kept their heads down, seeming as though they were lost in their chores. But Grace noticed the strain in their shoulders from the slightly shaking hands they used while working. As Richard proceeded to his next victim, Grace drew Laura's attention across the kitchen. The waitress seemed pale, and her customary happy attitude replaced by a glance of hardly veiled. Grace nodded a little reassuringly to her, but she could see the toll this surroundings was causing. Later that evening, as the event was running full steam, Grace heard two of the more seasoned line cooks cannot handle much more of this one in conversation. Of them murmured, his voice tightly under tension, "I have worked in some demanding kitchens before, but this is something else." The other cook nodded grimly. "I know what you mean. I have been searching for various professions. However, everyone knows that working under Chef Richard looks fantastic on a CV, but at what expense?" Grace's heart ached as she listened. She has seen gifted, fervent young. Under the weight of Richard's dictatorship, chefs transformed to anxious wrecks, their joy of food steadily shattered.
It was a
catastrophe for the culinary arts as well as for the people engaged in it. And as the weeks went by, Richard's attacks on Grace were more frequent and more intimate, it seemed her. His abuse only served to irritate him further. One day, while Grace was carefully tending to things,
there was still peace.
Polishing a set of pricey crystal glasses, Richard sneered on his workstation. Well, he continued, his voice tinged with disdain, "if it isn't our resident fossil. Tell me, Granny, the type of glasses you wore in the Stone Age." Grace glanced up at him. Her Serene, the chef, said coolly, "In my experience, fine. A crystal like this has existed for millennia, evidence of the continuing nature of quality." Richard's face grew black at her answer. He grabbed one of the glasses from her hands and raised it up too. With a sudden forceful movement, "The light, excellent craftsmanship, let's us see about that." Smashed the glass against the sink's edge, causing crystal's fragments to blast outward and cover the floor. Kitchen went silent, and everyone turned to see Richard and Grace. "Oops," Richard muttered, his voice icy. "Looks like you missed a region more clean than others." He turned on his heel and strode our way, leaving Grace to handle the mess. Right away, he was invisible. Several employees hurried over to assist, their faces amazement mixed with pity. "Are you all right, Grace?" Laura asked, her voice quivering. "Did any of the glass break?" Grace already shook her head, reaching for a broom. "I'm good, sweetheart, nothing damaged. However, my pride and maybe the budget of the restaurant for glassware," as they repaired the shattered. Although Richard had always been strict, Crystal Grace could hear the whispers filling the kitchen. This degree of purposeful damage was fresh. It seemed as though he was pushing someone to question him to provide him a justification for releasing his complete fury. When Laura turned away, still unsure, Grace let herself a little. The pieces were coming into place faster than she had expected. Shortly, very soon, it would be a happy smile. Time for the next stage of her scheme. The air carried obvious excitement as the presentation ready for what was supposed to be the culinary event of the year. A gathering of famous food bloggers and foreign food critics was scheduled to eat at the restaurant. Their combined viewpoints capable of transforming the grand cuisine into unprecedented levels of popularity, or to bring it down. The pressure in the kitchen had reached fever pitch. Chef Richard, his ego swollen to hazardous, magnified by the great stakes of the evening, were in exceptional form. His voice boomed across the kitchen, a continuous stream of criticism and threats. "Should any of you mess this up," he growled, "pace. After I'm done with you, you'll be lucky to find a job flipping burgers." "I make myself lucky too." The staff nodded solemnly, their features masks of concentration and hardly. Grace looked from her post, her heart weight evident. She was hiding terror. The toll surroundings was causing on everyone, the trembling hands, the darting eyes, the obvious sense of dread that loomed above the kitchen like a storm cloud. Richard positioned himself at the pass and started to receive first orders. Examining every meal with laser-like attention, nothing escaped his critical eye. A sauce that was a bit too thin, a garnish slightly overdone, a chunk of fish. It wasn't exactly centered. "This is trash," he yelled, slamming a plate back at a horrified Q. "Cook, are you attempting to sabotage again?" "This is right now." Grace kept her head down, concentrating on her chores, but she couldn't help observing how the tension in the kitchen seemed to be influencing the food. Dishes typically flowing from station to station were being hurried. Errors were occurring and quickly hid the perfectionism that had formerly been the grand cuisine hallmark. Collapsing beneath the weight of worry and anxiety as the evening progressed, became clearly things were not going as expected. Plates were being returned from the dining room, almost certainly from the wrong direction. Never happened at the Grand Cuisine. The whispers from the servers grew increasingly frantic, their faces pinched with concern as they sent the critics less than passionate reactions. Richard's cheeks reddened with every minute that passed. Frayed at the margins, he started micromanaging every station, second-guessing even his most seasoned. Usually a well-oiled machine started to splutter and stall under. His controlling demeanor came to a head when the last course, Richard's hallmark dish, is a delicate and sophisticated one. Dessert was ready to go, and the pastry chef showed the plates for inspection. Richard's eyes narrowed. What this he's jabbing is. One finger at the complex sugar work that adorned every dessert. It's sloppy and uneven. It's amateur. The pastry chef, a gifted young woman who had studied under some of Paris's top chefs, strove to defend her work, chef. Each item was created with the utmost care. The little variations are deliberate to evoke a more natural feeling. Richard was beyond reason in a. He moved suddenly, violently, sweeping his arm over the counter to send the beautiful treats flying to the floor.
The sound
of breaking ceramic boomed through the deliberately silent kitchen, and I yelled the only thing that's deliberate here. Your incompetence is invisible to me. The pastry chef stood there startled, with humiliation wearing on her face, and with a gentle SOB she ripped off her apron and fled the kitchen. The rest of the crew stared in terrified silence, frozen in place. It was Grace realized she could stand by no more, laying down her dishcloth at this instant, and moved forward with a calm yet forceful voice, saying loud enough, "Chef Richard," for everyone to hear. Maybe we should all pause to let Richard whirled on her face, twisted with wrath. You dared to speak, and you were nothing but a washed-up person. Elderly woman struggling to keep up with the dishes. What could you possibly know about running a kitchen of this? Even Richard saw he had crossed a line. The kitchen turned deathly silent. His ego wouldn't help either. Let him pull back now. Advanced on Grace. His voice dropped to a perilous silence. Growl, you want to know why you're here? Washing dishes at your age? You're a failure. You couldn't handle it in a real kitchen. Hence you ended up at the base of the food chain. And now you have the arrogance to challenge my. Grace stayed her ground. Her cool had a sharp contrast to Richard's. Fury. Chef remarked gently, I understand you're under a lot of pressure, but she was furious. Treating your street crew this way won't help to enhance the food or service it provides. Only. Enough, Richard yelled. Then he grabbed Grace's arm forcefully, dragging her in the direction of the dining room. You know so much. Let's find out what our distinguished visitors have to say about following advice from a. Staff members stared in terror as Richard pulled Grace across the kitchen door into the dining area. Heads turned to see the sight playing out before them, and the quiet hum of discussion faded. Richard addressed the room at Grace's arm, gesturing aggressively at her. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry for the interruption, but I thought you would like to meet the actual cause of any letdowns you might have gone through this evening. He turned to Grace, his words dripping with disdain. Go ahead, enlighten. We all tell these fine diners, these great critics, on how we should operate this restaurant. I'm sure they are. The room was so still that one could hear a pin drop. The diners looked uneasy, dying to hear the wisdom of a dishwasher. Some averting their gaze, others observing the scene develop with a mix of fascination and disdain. At one table among well-dressed people, clearly the food critics traded crucial. Grace inhaled deeply and looked around the room. This was not the way she had intended for things to turn out, but maybe it was for the best. Sometimes the truth needs to be exposed in the most brutal light for meaningful change to take place for women. And gents, she started her speech clear and consistent. I'm sorry for disturbing your evening. What you're doing? Seeing is the sad end of a poisonous workplace that has been rotting for far too long. Richard's face grew an even darker red. How dare you, he started, but Grace held up a hand, silencing him with a glance. I can be just a dishwasher in your eyes, Chef Richard, she said, but I have seen more kitchens and more cooks than you have cooked dinners, and I can tell. You operate a kitchen driven by ego and fear. Never will make really excellent cuisine. It will never have that spark of delight, even if it may win awards. And please, reviewers, That love transforms wonderful food into something transcendent and turned to confront the customers coming here tonight expected perfection, but true perfection. In cooking, passion and innovation from a team working together comes from nowhere other than bullying and intimidation. Together in harmony, what you tasted tonight comes from a kitchen in anarchy of gifted chefs too terrified of response based on confidence for their own feelings. The crowd remained quiet for a minute as her comments set in. Then, to everyone's astonishment, a slow clap started. From the critics' table, additional patrons started to applaud, spreading over. Richard stood in the room, his face covered in a mask of perplexity and rage. Opened his lips to talk, but before he could, I believe we heard a fresh voice piercing the hubbub. Enough, all heads turned to find a man in his early 40s flawlessly dressed in a tailed suit in the entryway. Fit his presence demanding attention. Robert Davis was the owner and CEO. Robert strode his perfection into the room, staring at the spectacle before. He nodded to Grace, a little smile at the corners of his mouth, then turned to face the room. Ladies and gentlemen, I have to admit, for this inappropriate exhibition, this is not what the grand cuisine represents, nor the type of behavior we support among any of our employees independent of their. He turned to Richard. His voice was icy. Chef, I believe it would be appropriate for us to have a private conversation if you would join me. As Robert carried a shell-shocked Richard out the door, whispers burst in the room. Grace was besieged by both customers and employees, both keen to see more of her story. Laura pushed through the throng, eyes bright with awareness. Grace, she muttered. Who are you truly, Grace? Patting Laura's hand. Just someone who is very passionate about this business and the employees working here. Now, why don't we all get back to work? We should be ready since there will be some significant changes around here. There was a fresh excitement in the air as the team returned into the kitchen, the strain and anxiety they had been carrying. Constant friends for so long were replaced with a wary optimism, whatever transpired going forward. All knew one thing for sure: the Grand Cuisine would never be the same following the meal. Room encounter. The Grand Cuisine was alive with tense energy and conjecture. While the dining room personnel battled too, the kitchen crew gathered in small groups, whispering among themselves. Keep a normal attitude for the last visitors at the luxurious office hidden on the Robert Davis, the top floor of the restaurant, sat at his massive desk with fingers steepled as he watched Chef Richard with a mixture of disappointment and restraint. The bombastic tyrant of the kitchen seemed to have shrunk in on himself. Gone seemed angry. Richard, for his part, place found a man looking lost in his chef's white, hanging off him like an inappropriate. Robert started his speech low and under control. How would you have dressed? Close. We came to ruin everything tonight. Years of hard effort. My father's legacy, practically all of it, almost destroyed because of your ego. Richard moved uneasily in his seat. Mr. Davis, I can clarify. That woman finds it difficult to handle the demands of running a kitchen of this quality. Robert held up a hand, silencing her. That woman, as you so dismissively name, she has forgotten more about running a profitable restaurant than you will ever know, but we will discuss that later. Now I would like to hear your interpretation of events, and Richard, the first, advise you to pick your words very carefully. Attentively, for a time, Richard stopped and felt the ground moving under his feet. He knew his position. Once so safe was now unstable. Old habits die hard, and soon he was returning to the strategies that had worked so effectively in the past: deflection, justifications, and Mr. Davis started slinking forward. Really, you have to realize this. Blatant lies. Perfection's pressure we face every night is not only our name. Rather, it is our norm, and occasionally we retain that. Standard demands strong leadership. Robert's expression stayed apathetic, giving nothing away, motivated by the absence of quick criticism. Richard, tonight was quite demanding. We had some detractors in, and everyone was on edge. I suppose I could have been a little harsh with some of the workers, but it was only because I really cared so strongly. Worried maintaining the Grand Cuisine's reputation, stopped assessing Robert's response. Noticing no change in his employer's attitude, he continued, his confidence developing with every. Regarding that dishwasher, well, I regret to admit she has been a hassle. Day one, lazy. negligent, always pushing her nose where it does not belong tonight. She almost destroyed all she was carrying late. Clean plates that threw off our whole timing, and then dared to challenge my techniques before the... Richard's voice rose in the whole kitchen, his face flushed with remembered wrath. Can you see a dishwasher assuming to be my guide on running my kitchen? I have to make an example of her for the benefit of the restaurant you see. He had created a self-satisfied smirk playing at the corners of his mouth in his head. First great story that portrayed him as the Bigoted hero bravely defending standards in the face of Robert's insubordination and lack of ability stayed quiet. For a long minute his gaze never left Richard's face when he at last said his. Though the voice was subdued, there was a steel underlying it that made Richard smile. Falter, that is quite a narrative, Richard, quite a story, so let me tell you what truly happened tonight. Robert was stepping around the desk to immediately face Helen Davis. My mother knows more about that dishwasher you so carelessly rejected.
She is
running a profitable restaurant than you will ever be. Richard's face lost of color. He opened his mouth to talk, but Robert's voice got more forceful with every word he spoke. For weeks at my request, my mother has been working covertly in this kitchen. Whispers about. I didn't want to create the poisonous atmosphere you would have regarding the growing staff anger and terror. Surely, the man I relied on with regard to the legacy of my father couldn't have fallen so far. He shook his head, disappointed in every wrinkle of his face. I was wrong tonight. I seen personally the type of leadership you believe to be required to uphold our standards. I observed you mistreating hundreds of employees and belittling EIR work. Dollars worth of food and tools during your outbursts, and worst of all, I saw you drag an old woman, my mother, into the dining room to embarrass her in front of our guests. Richard collapsed in his chair. At last, Mr. Davis, I felt the full weight of his deeds. I knew nothing. If you had known her, you would have treated her with respect, knowing who she was. Robert ended for him. His voice was sharp. Exactly the issue, Richard. You shouldn't have to know someone's position or relationship to treat them with fundamental human dignity. He turned around the desk, sighing heavily as he settled into his chair. You could tell my father had a vision he wanted to realize when he started this restaurant. Produce not only excellent cuisine, but also a venue where people might gather, where imagination might blossom, somewhere that would raise the next generation of chefs. Robert corrected Richard using a piercing gaze. Instead, you've converted it into a glorified sweat business, driven away gifted cooks, smashed the spirits of new cooks, all to satisfy your own ego and for what a few shining examples mean. Reviews, some brilliant awards. Well worth the human cost. Richard sat in shocked silence. At last, the weight of his axe sank in for the first time in years, and he sensed the stirrings of Real. Robert slumped back in his chair, his face blank. I suppose it's time we talked about your future at the Grand Cuisine, Richard, or more importantly, the absence. Thus, as the weight of the circumstances descended upon him, Richard knew his world. The empire he had assumed he would build was falling around him, and as he sat there dealing with the results of his wonder, was there any way he might save not just his career, but also the person he would have been? As the dispute between Robert and Richard developed in the Grand Cuisine office above the kitchen was a hive of anxious energy, staff members whispering among themselves in tiny groups. Deliberate looks at the office door. The events of the evening had rocked everyone to their very core, and spurred conjecture ran wild about what would follow. Among this anarchy, Grace stood coolly at her station, carefully sorting the stack of dishes left over from the unfortunate supper service. Even knowing her actual identity, she had insisted on completing her change. The work doesn't cease simply because the cat's out of the bag, she had mentioned with a smile. Laura, still in shock from the revelations of the evening, walked Grace gently. The young waitress had always felt the modest dishwasher had more than first appeared, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. Grace started, her voice just above a whisper. I don't even know what to say. Always. Grace looked up from her sewing, and her eyes sparkling with a mix of cunning and compassion. The mother of the owner, the big boss's secret inspector. She laughed gently. Laura has been called many names in my life, but ultimately, Grace is simply a woman who has seen a lot of knowledge gained and is quite passionate about this business and... Laura shook her head in wonder, but why go through all this? The people that work here could have just thrown my weight about Grace finished for her, sighing, setting down the... She had been washing that not fit my taste, but importantly, it would not have given us the truth. Sometimes you have to experience a situation from the ground up in order truly to grasp it. She indicated about the kitchen her. Emotion becoming severe. This restaurant is more than simply a business to our family. It was my late. When Robert took over, his husband promised to respect that legacy. But somewhere along the road, we began to hear whispers regarding the pressure, the fear, the poisonous. Grace's eyes grew far gone in memory from the surroundings that had become home. Yes, the standards were high. I recall when this kitchen was a joyful space for creative expression. Though the labor was difficult, the companionship based on a shared interest made the viewing of what it had all worth. Become under Chef Richard's reign. Laura nodded gently, knowing this. Dawning in her eyes, you came to experience what we were going through for yourself. Precisely, exactly, Grace confirmed Robert, and I agreed that the only way to really... Knowing that I was supposed to live it, I became Grace the dishwasher at the lowest rung on the kitchen ladder, and... Let me tell you, she turned to face Laura completely and had an eye-opening encounter. Her tone softened, but it wasn't quite terrible. You know, I noticed the anxiety, the stress, the nasty behavior, but I also observed times of great compassion and fortitude. You're all looked out for each other. What made you able to produce beauty and deliciousness even in the most hostile environments? That's what persuaded me this place is worth keeping. Laura felt tears welling up in her eyes. All the tension, all the terror she had been suppressing for so long suddenly surged to the front. She inquired, her voice faltering, to us to the what now? Restaurant. Grace reached out to softly squeeze Laura's hand. Now, my darling, we rebuild. The grand cuisine isn't perfect. We take what we have learned, the good and the negative, and use it to produce something greater. Just a name. Every day we aim for this in our cooking, presentation, and most importantly, treatment of every other. She looked up at the office door, a determined glitter in her eye. Robert is up there right now having a long overdue chat with Chef Richard. I'm not sure exactly what will happen, but I do know that things will change around here and that we will need all hands on deck to make it work. Just then, the office door opened. The whole kitchen fell quiet as Robert surfaced, his face somber but determined. Behind him, looked shell-shocked and deflated, came Chef Richard. Robert cleared his throat, addressing the whole staff. Please pay me attention. We had a difficult evening, to say the least, yet out of this anarchy we haven't had a chance to redefine what perfection entails, not only for our clients, but also for each of us who works here. He stopped his eyes to sweep the kitchen. The next days and weeks will bring some significant changes. Though change can be frightening, I want you all to know that your opinions are appreciated, and collectively we'll produce something very unique here, as Robert kept delineating his. Looking at the staff members' faces in the grand cuisine, Grace's future, she sensed optimism dawning in their eyes, unsure smiles starting to develop, but she also saw doubt, especially when their eyes locked on Chef Richard, sitting by Robert's side, seeming more lost and defeated than anybody had ever seen. Robert, sensing the strain, dealt with the elephant in the room. Many of you are worrying about Chef Richard's future with us, and the fact is we have had a protracted and challenging discussion regarding the events that have happened not only tonight but over past months and years. He looked to Richard, his countenance a mix of regret and worry. Hope Chef would want to say something to the squad. Richard walked forward, and for the grandiose, larger-than-life persona that had dominated the scene looked to struggle to find her voice. Gone kitchen for so long, in its place stood a man with human imperfection. Vulnerable, he started, his voice to break slightly, cleared his throat, then tried. Once more, I owe you all an apology. No more than that. I owe you a deep and sincere apologies for my actions about your care and the poisonous surroundings I created. He turned around the kitchen, staring at every staff member, some of which met his steady gaze. Others turned away, the still too raw scars, but I persuaded myself that The only way I could have you achieve greatness was by applying my techniques. The pressure I put on you caused the dread I instilled. Keep our standards. I was incorrect so horribly, destructively. Richard's gaze went to Grace, and a flutter of shame passed across his cheeks. Took someone with actual insight and power to demonstrate my mistakes of behavior, someone having nothing to prove, but turned back to the staff. His voice opted to place herself in line of fire to guard others. Getting better makes me not sure I deserve forgiveness. But I want you all to know that right now I recognize the harm I have done to this restaurant, to all of you, and to myself. And I am resolved to do everything it takes to correct. A great silence over the kitchen as Richard's words sank in. Laura was the one who at last broke it with her voice. Calm but strong, chef remarked, "I won't claim that the past can be undone. You have pushed away a lot of talent and harmed many people.
But I
think of me as speaking for many of us when I say that we are ready to offer you that if you are really dedicated to change." Though forgiveness was not yet, chance whispers of agreement flowed through the staff.
It was A.
Robert nodded, a little smile that fit the corners of his mouth beautifully. Stated Laura, "And that leads me to our following actions. Chef Richard will be off. He will be closely working with industry mentors and undertaking intensive leadership during this period of absence. Training only if he can show actual long-lasting change will be welcomed back into the Los Angeles Perfection family, not as the only authority, but as part of a team under collective leadership. He sought to solve the whole. While this is going on, staff members will be bringing in some fresh ideas from visiting chefs, culinary inventors, and most significantly, we will be looking to all of you for ideas on how we might make the Grand Cuisine not merely a fantastic restaurant, but a fantastic place to work." As Robert kept outlining his plans for the future made Grace feel pride and hope bursting in her heart. She had started this undercover mission not to demolish, but rather to repair, to remind everyone from passion. True perfection comes not from fear and dominance, but from lowliest dishwasher to the head chef. As the conference came to an end, and the team started to scatter, each lost in contemplation over the upcoming changes, Grace, Richard, the once dominant chef, seemed almost shy as he stood before her. Her Mrs. Davis started, then corrected herself. "Grace, I'm not sure where." "The things I said." Grace held up a hand, stopping Richard, "thus beginning the way I treated you. Let me tell you something. In the kitchen, as in life, everyone makes mistakes. The real test is this. Being a chef is not in never burning the source it is in. Rather, your recovery from it has burned far more than source, but the current concern is how." Richard nodded slowly. "Will you be able to recover?" Knowing dawning in his eyes, "I will do whatever it takes," he murmured gently, "and I have forgotten why I decided to be a chef in the first place. First position, the delight of developing talent to make people happy with cuisine. I wish to find." Grace grinned once again, a glitter in her eye. "Good young man. It sounds like you're on. Remember, a little humility will make all the difference in seasoning from too much of anything." Ego. As Richard turned away, obviously considering her thoughts, Grace felt Robert was sitting at her side, gazing at her with a mixture of respect and, "Mom, he shook his head when we came up with this idea. I never would have guessed it would turn out quite like this. You never cease to wow me." Grace laughed, patting her son's cheek lovingly. "Life has a habit of surprising us, doesn't it? Now don't think this implies I'm retiring to a rocking chair. I hope to be consulted on all important choices moving forth after all." Now Robert chuckled, the sound reverberating. "I have quite the different viewpoint on this location." The Grand Cuisine was filled with true delight and laughter as the kitchen was used for the first time in too long. It was the first action on a new journey, one that promised to be demanding. Yet finally, as the evening came to an end and the last of the staff members filed, Grace looked one last time around the kitchen. She almost could see the ghosts of the past, and the rage the crushed spirits caused. Fading away was yet much to be done. A faint hope for the future replaced it, to heal many wounds. Nevertheless, the components of success were all. Grace nodded satisfactorily, hung her apron for the last time, and, although her labor was far from finished, covert mission was complete. The Grand Cuisine was She felt it would be the best hour the restaurant has ever seen as she prepared to start a new era. Yet have you ever seen or personally engaged in toxic conduct in a highly pressurized workplace like the Grand Cuisine Kitchen? And do you believe the gastronomic field is especially prone to ignore or justify such behavior? Share your ideas or experiences in the comments below. I would be happy to read them, and should you find enjoyment in this story of culinary drama and redemption, I cordially encourage you to follow my channel. I pour my heart into creating these motivating tales for you. My motivation comes from your support. I value you traveling this road. Disclaimer: this channel is in opposition to all forms of human rights violations, intolerance, bigotry, and discrimination. The narratives that are presented here are original works that were designed to encourage constructive dialogue, comprehension, and introspection. Respect for diversity and the preservation of human dignity are the guiding principles for the creation of all content.